The marble conference room at Meridian Global fell into stunned silence as Henry Smith rose from his corner position, his Navy janitor's uniform a stark contrast against the sea of tailored Armani suits. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he stepped forward, the sound of his work boots echoing against polished Italian floors. "Don't sign the $8 billion deal," he said, his voice cutting through the champagne celebration like a blade through silk. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 47th floor, financial reporters crowded behind velvet ropes, cameras ready to capture the historic merger between Meridian Global and Zenith Pharmaceuticals, a deal that would create the world's largest biotech empire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Hartwell, the 36-year-old CEO who had built Meridian Global from a struggling startup into a Fortune 100 powerhouse, froze with her Mont Blanc pen hovering inches above the signature line. Her emerald eyes locked onto Henry's weathered face, searching for answers in the depths of determination she saw there. Around the mahogany table, board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, their confident smiles evaporating like morning mist. Security guards in black suits moved toward Henry with practiced efficiency, their earpieces crackling with urgent whispers. His 11-year-old daughter Emma's future hung precariously in the balance, her diabetes medication, their cramped apartment in Riverside Heights, the scholarship application sitting on their kitchen table. The former biochemical engineer, now pushing a maintenance cart through these same hallways for the past 2 years, knew he had exactly 10 seconds before being dragged from the room that once might have been his domain. But Victoria raised her perfectly manicured hand, stopping the approaching security team mid-stride. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows caught the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a gift from her late father when she'd first taken over the company. "Everyone out," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her a spot on Forbes' Most Powerful Women list 3 consecutive years. Her gaze never left Henry's face as executives, lawyers, and board members filed out in confused silence. "Except you," she said, pointing directly at the janitor who had just shattered the most important moment of her career. "You stay." The heavy oak doors closed with a resonating thud, leaving Victoria and Henry alone in the opulent boardroom where deals worth billions were routinely decided. The unsigned merger documents lay spread across the table like a battlefield map, each page representing months of negotiations, due diligence, and legal maneuvering. Outside, she could hear the muffled voices of her panicked executives, trying to explain the delay to increasingly impatient reporters. "You have exactly 60 seconds, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "to convince me why I shouldn't have you arrested for corporate sabotage and disrupting the largest pharmaceutical merger in history." Her fingers drummed against the polished table surface, a nervous habit her business school professors had failed to break despite their best efforts. Henry reached into the breast pocket of his uniform, extracting a folded piece of paper with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every movement count. "Because buried in Section 847C of that contract," he said, pointing to the thick stack of documents, "is a clause that will kill your company within 18 months. His voice grew stronger with each word, the trace of his former confidence beginning to surface through years of practiced invisibility. Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the mask of corporate composure cracking just enough to reveal the brilliant mind that had revolutionized 3 different drug categories before her 30th birthday. She had built Meridian Global on a foundation of life-saving medications, turning her father's small research lab into a global empire that had brought hope to millions of patients worldwide. The irony wasn't lost on her that the janitor standing before her might be the only person in the building who truly understood what was at stake. Zenith's manufacturing plants in Southeast Asia have been falsifying safety reports for the past 14 months, Henry continued, unfolding his paper to reveal handwritten notes and calculations. The bacterial contamination in their diabetes medication line isn't just a quality control issue, it's systematic fraud designed to cut costs before the merger. Once this deal closes and your quality assurance protocols are integrated with theirs, every batch of insulin will be compromised. The blood drained from Victoria's face as the implications hit her. Meridian Global's reputation had been built on unwavering safety standards and life-saving innovation. A contamination scandal wouldn't just destroy the company. It would betray the trust of diabetic patients worldwide, including children like his daughter Emma, who depended on their medications to survive each day. "How could a janitor possibly know this?" she asked, though something in Henry's precise terminology and the way he discussed manufacturing protocols suggested there was far more to his story than met the eye. Henry met her gaze with steady resolve, the weight of 2 years spent in shadows finally lifting from his shoulders. "Because before I cleaned these offices, ma'am, I designed the safety protocols for 3 of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. And I know corporate fraud when I see it, even when it's buried in $8 billion worth of legal documents." Stay with us until the end to discover how a single father's desperate act of courage uncovered a conspiracy that threatened millions of lives, and what happened when 2 worlds, separated by power, wealth, and circumstance, collided in the most unexpected way possible. This is the story of how sometimes the most important deals aren't signed on paper, but written in the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evening before that fateful boardroom confrontation, Henry Smith moved through the gleaming corridors of Meridian Global like a ghost in navy blue. His maintenance cart rolled silently across the polished marble floors of the executive wing, the soft squeak of its wheels, the only sound breaking the after-hours stillness. At 11:47 p.m., the building belonged to him and the handful of other night shift workers who kept the corporate machine running while the executives slept in their suburban mansions. Henry preferred these quiet hours. The artificial smiles and power handshakes had long since departed with the setting sun, leaving behind only honest silence and the steady rhythm of work. He methodically emptied trash bins, wiped down conference tables, and ensured that every surface gleamed for the morning's important meetings. There was dignity in this routine, he told himself, a different kind of purpose than he'd once known, but purpose nonetheless. The 36th floor housed the executive suites, where decisions affecting millions of patients were made daily. Henry had been cleaning these offices for exactly 23 months now, ever since the night he'd answered a Craigslist ad for discretionary custodial services, background check required. The irony wasn't lost on him that his advanced degree in biochemical engineering had qualified him for the security clearance needed to empty the trash of people who now made more in bonuses than he'd earned in his entire former career. He paused outside Victoria Hartwell's corner office, noting the light still burning behind the frosted glass doors. Most executives cleared out by 7 p.m., but Victoria was different. She often worked until midnight, poring over research reports and clinical trial data, with the intensity of someone who understood that her decisions meant the difference between life and death for patients worldwide. Through the glass, Henry could see her silhouette hunched over her desk, surrounded by towers of documents and empty coffee cups. The sight reminded him painfully of himself during his days at Phoenix Biotech, when he'd spend countless nights analyzing safety protocols and manufacturing standards. Back then, he'd believed that dedication and expertise were enough to protect people, before he'd learned how easily both could be swept aside by corporate priorities and legal maneuvering. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patterson, his neighbor, who watched 11-year-old Emma during his night shifts. Emma's blood sugar dropped to 65 around 10 p.m., gave her glucose tablets. She's stable at 98 now and sleeping peacefully. Don't worry, kids are resilient. See you in the morning. Henry's chest tightened with the familiar cocktail of gratitude and guilt that defined his daily existence. Mrs. Patterson, a retired nurse, had become their guardian angel since they'd moved to the modest apartment complex in Riverside Heights. She never asked for payment, understanding instinctively that a single father working minimum wage while managing a diabetic child was already stretched beyond his limits. Emma's insulin alone cost $340 per month, even with their basic insurance plan. He checked his watch, 12:15 a.m. His shift ended at 6 a.m., giving him just enough time to grab a few hours of sleep before Emma woke up for school. She had started 5th grade at Riverside Elementary 3 weeks ago, and despite the challenges of being the new kid, she was thriving academically. Her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, had already called to discuss advanced placement opportunities and potential scholarship programs for gifted students. Emma's brilliance was both Henry's greatest pride and his deepest worry. She deserved opportunities he couldn't provide, specialized schools, enrichment programs, the kind of future his former salary might have afforded. Instead, she was growing up in a two-bedroom apartment where the air conditioning barely worked and the neighbors' arguments echoed through thin walls at all hours. As Henry pushed his cart toward the pharmaceutical research wing, he reflected on the strange turns life could take. 2 years ago, he'd been Dr. Henry Smith, senior safety analyst at Phoenix Biotech, earning a six-figure salary and presenting at international conferences on contamination prevention protocols. His wife Sarah had been alive then, battling the rare autoimmune disease that would eventually claim her life despite access to the best medical care money could buy. The transition from respected professional to invisible service worker had been surprisingly smooth in some ways. People looked through janitors, making them privy to conversations and documents they'd never share with peers. Henry had overheard merger discussions, witnessed heated arguments about clinical trial results, and seen confidential memos left carelessly on desks. He'd trained himself to forget these glimpses behind the corporate curtain, understanding that his family's stability depended on his invisibility. But tonight felt different. As he entered the research wing, something in the air seemed charged with possibility, or perhaps danger. The usual stack of papers beside the industrial shredder had grown into a small mountain, suggesting that tomorrow's big announcement was generating more than the typical volume of confidential waste. Henry had learned not to look too closely at discarded documents. Curiosity had cost him everything once before, and he couldn't afford another mistake. Emma needed stability, predictability, and most importantly, the health insurance that came with his steady employment. Her diabetes management required regular endocrinologist visits, continuous glucose monitoring supplies, and a carefully maintained stock of emergency medications. Yet as he approached the overflowing recycling bin outside the executive conference room, Henry couldn't help but notice the Zenith Pharmaceuticals logo repeated across dozens of discarded printouts. Tomorrow's merger signing would create the largest pharmaceutical conglomerate in history, a deal he'd been hearing whispered about in elevators and coffee lines for months. He emptied the bin mechanically, trying not to read the scattered fragments of text that caught his eye. But one phrase, printed in bold red letters across a partially shredded quality control report, made his blood run cold. Batch contamination rates exceeding acceptable parameters by 847%. Henry's hands froze on the recycling bag. After 23 months of practiced blindness, the biochemist in him had awakened with a vengeance. Henry stared at the contamination report fragment, his mind racing through calculations he hadn't performed in over 2 years. An 847% contamination rate wasn't just a quality control issue, it was a public health catastrophe waiting to happen. His hands trembled as he carefully extracted the partially shredded document from the recycling bin, piecing together the torn edges like a jigsaw puzzle of corporate negligence. The report was dated 3 weeks ago, bearing the official letterhead of Zenith Pharmaceuticals' manufacturing facility in Bataan Province, Philippines. What he could read between the shredded sections painted a picture of systematic safety violations that made his stomach churn. Bacterial colonies in insulin production lines. Falsified sterilization logs. Quality assurance managers pressured to sign off on contaminated batches to meet shipping deadlines. Henry's professional instincts kicked in automatically. He recognized the bacterial strain mentioned in the report, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, a particularly dangerous pathogen for immunocompromised patients. If this contamination had reached the insulin supply chain, diabetic patients worldwide could be facing life-threatening infections with their daily injections. Patients like Emma. His daughter's face flashed in his mind, her trusting smile that morning as she'd administered her routine insulin shot before breakfast. The same brand that, according to this document, might be carrying deadly bacteria from compromised manufacturing lines halfway around the world. The irony was devastating. The very medication keeping Emma alive could potentially kill her. But Henry knew better than to jump to conclusions based on a single shredded report. His years at Phoenix Biotech had taught him that pharmaceutical manufacturing involved multiple safety redundancies. There had to be oversight, secondary testing, regulatory compliance measures. Surely someone at Zenith would have caught such a massive contamination issue before products reached patients. He gathered the scattered papers more systematically now, his janitorial duties forgotten as the scientist in him took control. What he found in the next 20 minutes of careful document reconstruction chilled him to the bone. This wasn't an isolated incident or a single facility problem. The contamination reports spanned 6 different manufacturing plants across 3 countries, all showing similar patterns of bacterial growth in insulin production lines. More disturbing were the email printouts mixed in with the laboratory reports. Internal communications between Zenith executives discussing quote, acceptable risk thresholds and, quote, post-merger liability transfers. One email chain, dated just 5 days ago, made his blood run cold. Manufacturing costs reduced by 34% through streamlined sterilization protocols. Contamination rates remain within acceptable parameters for our current market position. Once Meridian acquisition finalizes, their quality assurance team will handle all future compliance issues. Recommend accelerating current inventory shipments before integration date. Henry's hands shook as he photographed each document with his phone, the camera flash illuminating the damning evidence in stark detail. These weren't accidents or oversight failures. They were calculated business decisions. Zenith was knowingly shipping contaminated insulin to meet pre-merger financial targets, planning to dump the quality control problems onto Meridian Global after the deal closed. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Victoria Hartwell had built her company's reputation on uncompromising safety standards and life-saving innovation. If she unknowingly signed this merger tomorrow, Meridian Global would inherit legal liability for thousands of potentially lethal insulin doses already in circulation. The contamination scandal would destroy both companies, but more importantly, it would kill innocent patients who trusted their medications to keep them alive. Henry thought about Emma's endocrinologist, Dr. Walsh, who had emphasized during their last appointment how critical it was to maintain sterile injection techniques. Even the smallest infection can be serious for diabetic patients, she'd warned. Their immune systems are already compromised by blood sugar fluctuations. We can't afford to take any chances with contamination. Now Henry was looking at evidence of contamination on an industrial scale, hidden from regulators and patients by corporate executives who measured risk and profit margins rather than human lives. The weight of this knowledge settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He couldn't unknow what he'd discovered, couldn't pretend he hadn't seen the evidence of systematic fraud and patient endangerment. But what could he possibly do with this information? He was a janitor now, not a respected biochemical engineer. Who would believe him? More importantly, who would listen to someone whose professional credibility had been destroyed 2 years ago when he'd chosen financial security over scientific integrity at his previous job? The memory of that failure burned in his chest. When Phoenix Biotech had pressured him to approve questionable safety protocols for their arthritis medication, he'd eventually caved to protect his family's health insurance during Sarah's illness. The drug had later been recalled after causing liver damage in 37 patients, but by then, Henry had already been quietly terminated for unrelated performance issues. His reputation in the pharmaceutical industry had died with that compromise. Henry carefully folded the reconstructed documents and slipped them into his jacket pocket. Emma would be waking up in 4 hours, needing her morning insulin injection before school. The same insulin that might be killing children just like her in hospitals around the world. He couldn't live with that knowledge and do nothing, regardless of the personal cost. As he finished his shift in a daze, mechanically completing his remaining cleaning duties, Henry's mind churned through possible approaches. He could try contacting the FDA directly, but anonymous tips from janitors rarely prompted immediate action, especially against major pharmaceutical companies with armies of lawyers. He could reach out to investigative journalists, but proving the authenticity of documents he'd technically stolen from company trash would be nearly impossible. There was only one person who had both the authority and the immediate power to stop tomorrow's merger: Victoria Hartwell herself. But approaching a Fortune 100 CEO as a janitor with accusations of corporate fraud seemed like professional suicide. She would likely have him arrested for corporate espionage before he could finish explaining what he discovered. Yet as Henry walked through the pre-dawn darkness to his car, Emma's face remained fixed in his mind, along with the faces of thousands of other diabetic children, whose parents trusted companies like Meridian Global to keep their medications safe. The merger signing was scheduled for 2 p.m. tomorrow. He had less than 14 hours to find the courage to risk everything again, This time for people he'd never meet, whose lives depended on someone speaking up for them. The weight of moral choice pressed down on him with familiar intensity. 2 years ago, he'd chosen silence and security over speaking truth to power. This time, his daughter's life, and the lives of countless other patients, might depend on him finding the strength to do what he'd failed to do before. Henry sat in his beat-up Honda Civic in the employee parking garage, staring at the damning photographs on his phone screen. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, as memories he'd buried for 2 years came flooding back with crystalline clarity. The last time he'd held evidence of pharmaceutical fraud, his life had imploded in ways he was still trying to understand. It had started much like this: late nights, suspicious documents, the growing realization that lives were at stake. But back then, Dr. Henry Smith had been riding high as Phoenix Biotech's youngest senior safety analyst. A rising star in pharmaceutical quality assurance with a corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, and a reputation for uncompromising scientific integrity. Industry journals published his research on contamination prevention protocols. Conference organizers fought to get him as a keynote speaker. Sarah used to joke that he loved his microscope more than he loved her, until the diagnosis changed everything. Sarah's autoimmune condition had appeared suddenly, like a thief in the night. Systemic lupus erythematosus, the doctors called it, a cruel disease that turned her own immune system against her body. Within months, the vibrant pediatric nurse who had stolen his heart during medical school had become a fragile shadow, requiring constant care and experimental treatments that insurance companies loved to deny. The medical bills had arrived in waves: $47,000 for a 6-week stay in the intensive care unit, $12,000 monthly for immunosuppressive drugs, $8,000 for specialist consultations that lasted barely 20 minutes. Even with his 6-figure salary and premium health insurance, the copays and deductibles were drowning them. Sarah couldn't work, and 8-year-old Emma was struggling to understand why Mommy slept so much and why Daddy looked worried all the time. That's when Phoenix Biotech had offered him the Arthrogen Project, a fast-tracked arthritis medication with the potential to revolutionize joint pain treatment. The company was under intense pressure from investors to bring the drug to market ahead of competitors, and they needed their most trusted safety analyst to sign off on the manufacturing protocols. The promotion came with a $40,000 raise and stock options that would vest if the drug launched successfully. Henry had thrown himself into the Arthrogen analysis with desperate determination. His family's financial survival depended on this project succeeding, on him proving once again that his scientific rigor could overcome any challenge. But what he'd found in the manufacturing data had shaken him to his core. The pharmaceutical plant in Puerto Rico was cutting corners in ways that violated every safety protocol he'd ever written. Sterilization cycles were being shortened to increase production speed. Quality control testing was being conducted on selective samples rather than representative batches. Most damning of all, preliminary patient reports were showing elevated liver enzyme levels that suggested potential hepatotoxicity, liver damage that could prove fatal in vulnerable populations. Henry had documented everything meticulously, preparing a comprehensive report that recommended halting production until the manufacturing issues could be resolved. He'd worked 18-hour days for 3 weeks, double-checking every calculation, verifying every concern. The scientific evidence was irrefutable. Arthrogen, as currently manufactured, posed unacceptable risks to patient safety. When he'd presented his findings to the executive team, the response had been swift and brutal. Dr. Marcus Webb, the chief medical officer, had dismissed his concerns as theoretical overcautiousness. The manufacturing issues were within acceptable industry parameters, according to legal counsel. Most crushing of all, his direct supervisor had quietly suggested that Henry's objectivity might be compromised by his, quote, personal financial pressures. "We understand you're going through a difficult time with Sarah's condition," Dr. Reynolds had said with practiced sympathy. "Perhaps the stress is making you see problems that aren't really there. Why don't you take another week to review the data? I'm confident you'll find that your initial concerns were overstated." The message was clear: approve the drug or face professional consequences. Henry had gone home that night to find Sarah collapsed in their kitchen, too weak to prepare Emma's dinner. The medical bills on their kitchen table had grown into a mountain of final notices and insurance denials. Emma's school had called about unpaid lunch fees. Their mortgage company was threatening foreclosure proceedings. Henry had spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, torn between scientific integrity and family survival. Sarah needed those experimental treatments. Emma deserved stability and security. He couldn't protect his family's health if he lost his job and insurance coverage. The pharmaceutical industry was small and gossipy. Being labeled a troublemaker at Phoenix would make him unemployable anywhere else. 3 weeks later, Dr. Henry Smith had signed the amended safety report approving Arthrogen for manufacturing and distribution. He'd buried his concerns under layers of bureaucratic language and statistical qualifications that preserved plausible deniability while giving the company what it wanted. The drug launched 6 months later to tremendous fanfare and immediately boosted Phoenix Biotech's stock price by 40%. For 8 months, Henry had convinced himself he'd made the right choice. Sarah's treatments continued. Emma excelled in her gifted program at school. They'd even managed a family vacation to Disney World, their first in 3 years. Henry had received commendations for his, quote, collaborative approach to complex regulatory challenges and was being considered for promotion to Director of Quality Assurance. Then the first patient died. Maria Rodriguez, a 63-year-old grandmother from El Paso, had been taking Arthrogen for her rheumatoid arthritis when her liver began failing. The autopsy showed massive hepatocellular necrosis consistent with drug-induced toxicity. Within 2 weeks, similar cases were being reported across the country. 17 patients developed severe liver damage. 5 required emergency transplants. 3 died waiting for compatible donors. The FDA investigation that followed was thorough and merciless. Congressional hearings dissected every aspect of Arthrogen's approval process. Henry's original safety concerns were leaked to the press, along with his subsequent approval of the modified protocols. Overnight, he became the face of corporate malfeasance, the scientist who had sold his integrity for a paycheck. Phoenix Biotech had fired him quietly, citing, quote, performance issues unrelated to the current regulatory investigation. His professional reputation was destroyed. Pharmaceutical companies wouldn't return his calls. Academic institutions withdrew job offers. The very stock options that were supposed to secure his family's future became worthless as the company's value collapsed. Sarah had died 4 months later, her weakened immune system unable to fight off a routine infection. Without employer health insurance, Henry couldn't afford the experimental treatments that might have saved her. Emma, now 9 years old, had developed type 1 diabetes the following year, a cruel genetic lottery that required the same unwavering commitment to pharmaceutical safety that Henry had once compromised. Now sitting in the Meridian Global parking garage with evidence of another pharmaceutical cover-up in his hands, Henry felt the weight of that failure pressing down on him like a physical force. He'd chosen financial security over scientific integrity once before, and people had died because of his cowardice. The guilt had followed him through every menial job application, every night shift, every insulin injection he gave his daughter. But this time was different. This time, Emma's life was directly at stake, along with thousands of other diabetic patients who trusted their medications to be safe. The contaminated insulin wasn't a theoretical risk or a statistical probability. It was an immediate threat to his daughter's survival. Henry closed his phone and started the engine. He had 11 hours to find the courage he'd lost 2 years ago, to speak truth to power, even when everything he'd built with Emma could be destroyed in the process. The choice was terrifyingly clear. Remain silent and watch his daughter potentially die from contaminated medication, or risk everything to save her and countless others he'd never meet. This time he wouldn't choose security over lives, not again. Henry drove through the empty streets of Riverside Heights as dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The weight of the contamination evidence in his jacket pocket felt heavier with each mile, pressing against his chest like a lead shield that made breathing difficult. He had exactly 9 hours before Victoria Hartwell would sign the merger documents that would unleash contaminated insulin on an unsuspecting world. Back at their small apartment, Emma was still sleeping peacefully, her continuous glucose monitor softly beeping on the nightstand beside her bed. Henry stood in her doorway, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, memorizing the innocent trust on her sleeping face. In 3 hours, she would wake up and reach for her insulin pen, the same brand that, according to the documents burning a hole in his pocket, might be carrying deadly bacteria. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the kitchen with 2 steaming cups of coffee, her kind eyes immediately reading the distress written across Henry's features. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world," she said softly, handing him a mug. "Want to talk about it?" Henry accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the familiar comfort of her morning routine. Mrs. Patterson had been their anchor since Sarah's death, providing stability and love when his world had crumbled. She deserved to know what he was contemplating, what the consequences might mean for Emma if everything went wrong. "I discovered something at work last night," he began carefully, choosing his words like a surgeon selecting instruments. "Information that could save lives, but revealing it would probably cost me my job, maybe worse." Mrs. Patterson settled into her favorite armchair, the one positioned perfectly to keep watch over both apartments through the thin walls. At 72, she'd raised 5 children of her own and buried 2 husbands. Life had taught her when to push for details and when to simply listen. "Does this information affect Emma directly?" she asked, with the intuitive wisdom of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of human struggle. Henry nodded, unable to trust his voice for a moment. "It could kill her, along with thousands of other diabetic patients. I have evidence of systematic contamination in insulin manufacturing, covered up by executives who care more about merger profits than patient safety." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from concern to steel-hard determination. "Then you already know what you have to do," she said simply. "The question isn't whether you'll act, it's how you'll find the courage to act wisely." Henry spent the next hour laying out his impossible situation. He showed Mrs. Patterson the photographs on his phone, explaining the technical details in terms she could understand. The bacterial contamination levels that exceeded safety thresholds by hundreds of percentage points. The internal emails discussing acceptable risk parameters and post-merger liability transfers. The calculated decision to ship contaminated products before quality control integration could expose the fraud. "Who would believe me?" Henry asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake all morning. "I'm a night janitor with a destroyed reputation. Victoria Hartwell is one of the most powerful women in pharmaceuticals. Her security team will arrest me for corporate espionage before I can finish explaining what I found." Mrs. Patterson studied the evidence with the methodical attention she'd once applied to medical charts during her nursing career. "You're not thinking like the scientist you still are," she said finally. "You're thinking like a man who's been beaten down by circumstances. But look at what you've accomplished here. This analysis, these connections between manufacturing data and patient safety. This isn't the work of a janitor. This is the work of Dr. Henry Smith." She was right, and Henry felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the shame and defeat he'd carried for 2 years. The technical analysis he'd performed overnight had been instinctive, automatic, the product of expertise that couldn't be erased by job titles or professional setbacks. He might empty trash cans for a living, but his mind still processed pharmaceutical data with the precision of someone who dedicated his career to protecting patient safety. "Emma needs her insulin injection in 2 hours, Henry said, glancing toward her bedroom, "the same insulin that might be contaminated. I can't let her use it without knowing for certain whether it's safe, but I also can't deny her the medication that keeps her alive." Mrs. Patterson reached into her purse and extracted a small insulin pen, backup medication she kept for emergencies. "This batch is from last month, before the contamination date's in your evidence. It'll buy us time while you do what needs to be done." The simple gesture of support nearly broke Henry's composure. Here was someone who believed in him enough to share responsibility for Emma's care, who understood that some battles required trusted allies to hold the ground while the warrior advanced into dangerous territory. Henry pulled out his phone and began photographing the documents more systematically, organizing the evidence into a comprehensive digital file. Manufacturing facility reports, bacterial contamination data, executive emails, patient safety projections, everything a CEO would need to understand the full scope of the fraud her company was about to inherit. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. He needed a strategy that would get him into Victoria Hartwell's presence long enough to present his case before security removed him from the building. The merger signing was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the executive boardroom, with media coverage and board members present. Maximum visibility, minimum privacy. "I need to interrupt the signing ceremony," Henry said, the plan crystallizing in his mind with frightening clarity. It's the only moment when Victoria Hartwell will be in the same room with all the decision-makers, when the stakes are high enough that she can't simply dismiss what I'm saying. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. And after you speak up, what happens to you then? Henry considered the question with brutal honesty. Best case scenario. Victoria would listen to his evidence, investigate his claims, and halt the merger pending safety reviews. He might keep his job, might even be recognized for preventing a public health catastrophe. But more likely he'd be arrested, prosecuted for corporate espionage, and imprisoned while his daughter watched from the sidelines. Emma might lose me, he said quietly. She's already lost her mother. If I go to prison, she'll end up in foster care or with distant relatives who barely know her. Everything we've built together could disappear. The admission hung between them like a sword suspended by the thinnest thread. Mrs. Patterson reached across the space separating their chairs and took his hands in hers, her weathered fingers strong and warm. That child has already lost one parent to a disease that could have been treated if the system worked properly, she said firmly. Are you going to let her lose other children's parents to contaminated medicine that could be stopped if someone has the courage to speak up? Emma needs a father she can be proud of, someone who teaches her that doing the right thing matters more than staying safe. Henry felt the last of his resistance crumble under the weight of her wisdom. Mrs. Patterson was right. Emma deserved a father who stood up for what was right, even when the cost was enormous. Especially when the cost was enormous. Will you take care of her if everything goes wrong, he asked. That child is already family to me, Mrs. Patterson replied without hesitation. But everything won't go wrong because you're not going into this battle alone or unprepared. You're going in as the man you've always been, someone who puts patient safety above personal comfort. Henry spent the remaining hours before Emma woke up preparing for what might be his final act as a free man. He organized the contamination evidence into a clear, compelling presentation. He wrote a letter to Emma explaining his decision, to be opened only if he didn't come home. He transferred his modest savings into an account Mrs. Patterson could access for Emma's care. Most importantly, he allowed himself to remember who he had been before fear and circumstances had reduced him to shadows and silence. Dr. Henry Smith, pharmaceutical safety expert, devoted father, and protector of public health. Today, he would reclaim that identity, regardless of the consequences. When Emma woke up and reached for her insulin, Henry administered the injection using Mrs. Patterson's clean medication, watching his daughter's face for any sign of the trust she'd always placed in him. She smiled sleepily and hugged him tight, unaware that her father was about to risk everything to keep that trust sacred. I love you, sweetheart, he whispered into her hair, more than you'll ever know. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Global's executive boardroom as Henry adjusted his janitor's uniform one final time. His hands moved with deliberate precision as he positioned his maintenance cart near the marble conference table, the same steady movements that had made him invisible for 23 months. But today, invisibility would transform into the most visible moment of his life. Around the polished mahogany table, pharmaceutical industry titans celebrated what would become the largest biotech merger in history. Board members from both companies mingled with champagne glasses, their voices carrying the confident tones of people accustomed to reshaping entire industries with their signatures. Outside the towering windows, financial journalists had gathered behind velvet ropes, their cameras trained on the building where Victoria Hartwell would soon sign documents creating a pharmaceutical empire worth over $30 billion. Henry methodically wiped down surfaces and emptied decorative trash bins, his eyes cataloging every face in the room. He recognized several board members from industry magazines, Drive, Patricia Chen from the FDA Advisory Committee, Robert Steinberg, who'd built 2 previous pharmaceutical conglomerates, Maria Santos, whose venture capital firm had funded breakthrough cancer treatments. These were people who could authorize investigations, demand regulatory reviews, or halt mergers with a single phone call. Victoria Hartwell commanded the room's attention effortlessly, her emerald silk dress and perfectly styled auburn hair creating an aura of unshakable confidence. She moved between clusters of executives with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent years navigating corporate politics at the highest levels. When she laughed at board member jokes, her smile reached her eyes. When she discussed market projections, her voice carried the authority of someone who'd personally overseen every clinical trial and manufacturing decision. Henry had studied her background obsessively during his sleepless morning hours. Victoria had inherited Meridian Global at 28 when her father died suddenly of a heart attack, transforming a struggling research lab into a Fortune 100 company through sheer determination and scientific innovation. Her insulin formulations had revolutionized diabetes care for millions of patients worldwide. Her manufacturing standards were considered the gold standard for pharmaceutical safety protocols. She had no idea that in 12 minutes she would unknowingly take responsibility for contaminated medications that could kill the very patients she dedicated her life to protecting. The Zenith Pharmaceuticals delegation occupied the opposite end of the conference table, their expensive suits and practiced smiles masking the systematic fraud Henry had discovered in their manufacturing facilities. CEO Jonathan Reeves held court with board members, regaling them with stories of international expansion and market penetration strategies. His CFO, Rebecca Walsh, distributed final contract amendments with the efficiency of someone eager to complete the deal before anyone examined the details too closely. Henry recognized the body language of people with secrets to hide, the way Reeves avoided direct eye contact when discussing manufacturing capabilities. How Walsh's smile faltered whenever conversation turned to quality control integration timelines. The subtle tension in their shoulders that suggested they were counting minutes until the signing ceremony concluded and legal liability transferred to Meridian Global. At 1:47 p.m., legal teams distributed the final merger documents, thick stacks of paper representing months of negotiations, due diligence reviews, and regulatory approvals. Henry watched Victoria accept her copy with the reverence of someone who understood that her signature would determine the future of both companies and the patients they served. The media coordinator whispered instructions to camera crews positioned outside the boardroom's glass walls. Financial reporters adjusted their equipment for optimal angles of the historic signing. Stock market analysts prepared commentary that would influence trading decisions worth billions of dollars. Victoria's Mont Blanc pen appeared in her manicured hand with ceremonial significance. The room's conversation gradually quieted as executives positioned themselves for photographs that would commemorate the pharmaceutical industry's most significant merger. Board members raised champagne glasses in anticipation of toasts that would celebrate their collective business acumen. Henry felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the moment approached. Every survival instinct screamed at him to remain silent, to preserve the fragile stability he'd built with Emma over the past 2 years. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cleaning supplies, the familiar weight suddenly feeling foreign and inadequate. But then he thought of Emma's trusting smile that morning as she'd accepted her insulin injection. The way she'd hugged him goodbye before school, completely confident that Daddy would always protect her from harm. The photograph on their refrigerator showing Sarah in her hospital bed, weak but smiling as she'd made him promise to always put their daughter's welfare above everything else. Victoria's pen touched the signature line at exactly 1:52 p.m. "Don't sign the $8 billion deal," Henry said, his voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a scalpel through tissue. The boardroom's conversation died instantly. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. Camera flashes ceased. The only sound was the soft hum of climate control systems and Henry's own thundering heartbeat. Every face in the room turned toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Security guards positioned near the entrance straightened to attention, their hands moving instinctively toward communication devices. Board members exchanged bewildered glances, uncertain whether they'd witnessed a publicity stunt or a genuine security breach. Victoria's emerald eyes locked onto Henry's face with laser intensity, her pen suspended inches above the contract's signature line. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the CEO of Meridian Global and the night janitor who cleaned her offices stared at each other across a chasm of corporate hierarchy and social expectations. "Ma'am," Henry continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "there's contamination in the Zenith insulin manufacturing that will kill diabetic patients. I have documentation proving systematic safety violations and bacterial infections that exceed acceptable parameters by over 800%. Jonathan Reeves rose from his chair with the smooth precision of someone accustomed to managing corporate crises. "Security, please remove this individual immediately. We will not allow our merger ceremony to be disrupted by disgruntled employees making baseless accusations." But Victoria raised her hand. stopping the approaching security team with a gesture that carried absolute authority. Her gaze never left Henry's face as she processed his words, her brilliant mind already analyzing implications and calculating probabilities. "Everyone out," she commanded, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had built a pharmaceutical empire. Board members, executives, and legal teams began filing toward the exit in stunned silence. "Except you," she said, pointing directly at Henry. "You stay." The heavy oak doors closed with finality, leaving Victoria and Henry alone in the opulent boardroom where billions of dollars in deals were routinely negotiated. The unsigned merger documents lay spread across the table between them like a battlefield map, each page representing potential catastrophe if Henry's accusations proved accurate. "You have exactly 60 seconds, Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of absolute power, "to convince me why I shouldn't have you arrested for corporate sabotage and explain how a janitor could possibly know about pharmaceutical manufacturing contamination." Henry reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone, the screen displaying the first of dozens of photographs documenting Zenith's systematic fraud. "Because before I cleaned your offices, ma'am, I was Dr. Henry Smith, Senior Safety Analyst at Phoenix Biotech. And I know pharmaceutical contamination when I see it, even when it's hidden in $8 billion worth of legal documents." Victoria's expression shifted from skeptical authority to intense concentration as Henry methodically displayed the contamination evidence on his phone screen. Her manicured fingers traced the bacterial growth charts, while her brilliant mind processed implications that grew more devastating with each document. The boardroom's afternoon light cast sharp shadows across the merger papers as she absorbed the full scope of Zenith's systematic fraud. "Pseudomonas aeruginosa colonies in 17 separate production batches," she murmured, her voice tight with professional horror. "These contamination levels would cause sepsis in immunocompromised patients within hours of injection." Her emerald eyes met Henry's with newfound respect. "How did you obtain internal Zenith manufacturing reports?" Henry explained his discovery in the recycling bins, watching Victoria's face grow paler as she realized how close she'd come to inheriting legal responsibility for thousands of potentially lethal insulin doses. Her questions became increasingly technical, probing details that only someone with advanced pharmaceutical knowledge could answer. Henry found himself responding with the expertise he'd suppressed for 2 years, his scientific vocabulary returning with natural fluency. "The email correspondence suggests they've been shipping contaminated batches for 4 months, Victoria said, scrolling through Henry's photographs. "My God, this could affect diabetic patients across 3 continents. She looked up sharply. "Wait, you said your daughter is diabetic. What brand of insulin does she use?" "Novo Rapid," Henry replied quietly, "the same brand manufactured in their Baton facility." The color drained completely from Victoria's face. "We supplied that insulin to pediatric diabetes clinics nationwide last month. If even half of these contamination reports are accurate." She couldn't finish the sentence, but Henry understood. Children's hospitals across the country might be unknowingly administering potentially fatal injections to their most vulnerable patients. Victoria pressed her intercom with trembling fingers. "Dr. Martinez, I need you in the boardroom immediately. Emergency protocols." She turned back to Henry. "My chief medical officer needs to see this evidence. If you're right, we have to issue immediate product recalls and notify the CDC within hours." But before Dr. Martinez could respond, Victoria's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. Her expression darkened as she read the screen. "Rebecca Walsh from Zenith is demanding to know why the signing was delayed. She's threatening to walk away from the deal if we don't proceed within the next 30 minutes. Henry felt a chill of recognition. She's the CFO who authorized the contaminated shipments. The email chains show her signature on manufacturing cost reduction approvals that eliminated sterilization protocols. The boardroom doors burst open as Dr. Elena Martinez rushed in, her lab coat still bearing traces of whatever research she'd abandoned to respond to Victoria's emergency summons. A brilliant immunologist who'd developed 3 breakthrough vaccines before joining Meridian Global, she commanded immediate respect from both colleagues and competitors. "What's the medical emergency?" Dr. Martinez asked, then stopped short at seeing Henry in his janitor's uniform. "Victoria, why is maintenance staff in our confidential meeting?" "Because he may have saved our company from the worst pharmaceutical disaster since thalidomide." Victoria replied grimly. She handed over Henry's phone, watching her chief medical officer's expression change from confusion to horror as she absorbed the contamination data. Dr. Martinez's clinical training took over immediately. These bacterial concentrations would cause systemic infections in diabetic patients within 6 to 12 hours of injection. We're looking at potential casualties in the hundreds, possibly thousands. She looked up at Henry with newfound respect. How did you recognize the significance of these contamination levels? Henry was about to explain his background when Victoria's assistant's voice crackled through the intercom with panic-edged urgency. Miss Hartwell, there's been an incident at Children's Memorial Hospital. 7 pediatric diabetes patients were admitted to intensive care this morning with severe infections of unknown origin. The CDC is investigating possible contamination in their insulin supply. The words hit the boardroom like a physical blow. Victoria gripped the conference table edge, her knuckles white with tension. Dr. Martinez immediately began calculating infection timelines and contamination patterns. Henry felt his legs weaken as he realized that children exactly like Emma were already fighting for their lives because of the very contamination he'd discovered. Those children received insulin from the same batches documented in these manufacturing reports, Dr. Martinez said, her voice heavy with medical certainty. If we don't issue immediate recalls and notify every pediatric diabetes clinic in the country, we'll have a public health catastrophe by tomorrow morning. Victoria's phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for board member calls. The caller ID showed Jonathan Reeves from Zenith Pharmaceuticals. She glanced at Henry, then answered on speaker. Victoria, we need to finalize this merger immediately, Reeves' voice carried barely controlled desperation. Market conditions are shifting, and any further delays could jeopardize the entire deal structure. Our legal team is prepared to pursue damages if Meridian Global attempts to withdraw from our binding agreement. Jonathan, we've discovered potential safety issues with your insulin manufacturing that require immediate investigation, Victoria replied carefully, not yet ready to reveal the full extent of her knowledge. A long pause followed before Reeves responded, his tone shifting to calculated corporate damage control. Any manufacturing concerns are purely speculative and within normal industry parameters. Our quality assurance protocols meet all FDA requirements. I trust Meridian Global isn't allowing unfounded rumors to interfere with our carefully negotiated partnership. Henry stepped closer to the phone, his scientific integrity finally overriding years of enforced silence. Mr. Reeves, I have documentation showing bacterial contamination levels exceeding safety thresholds by over 800% in 17 separate production batches. Children are already hospitalized with infections directly traceable to your contaminated insulin. The line went silent for nearly 30 seconds before Reeves' voice returned, ice cold with legal calculation. Who is this individual, and how did he obtain confidential Zenith manufacturing data? Victoria, I hope you realize that corporate espionage is a federal crime punishable by up to 20 years in prison. Victoria felt the trap closing around them. Reeves was right about the legal implications. Henry had technically stolen confidential documents regardless of his moral motivations. Even if the contamination evidence proved accurate, Henry could face serious criminal charges for obtaining it illegally. Furthermore, Reeves continued with predatory precision, any delays in this merger will trigger penalty clauses totaling $400 million in damages to Zenith Pharmaceuticals. I trust Meridian Global is prepared to honor its contractual obligations, despite whatever disruptions you're currently experiencing. Dr. Martinez whispered urgently to Victoria, the children at Memorial Hospital are in critical condition. 2 more pediatric facilities have reported similar infections in the past hour. We're looking at a national health emergency. Victoria faced an impossible choice. Sign the merger and inherit legal responsibility for contaminated medicine that was already killing children, or halt the deal and face both criminal charges against Henry and massive financial penalties that could bankrupt her company. Either path led to destruction, but only one offered the possibility of saving lives. Her phone buzzed with another emergency message. This time, the text came from her security director. FBI agents in lobby requesting immediate meeting regarding allegations of corporate fraud and document theft, accompanied by federal prosecutors. Henry saw the message over Victoria's shoulder and felt his world tilting toward inevitable collapse. The federal investigation he'd feared was already underway, triggered by someone who discovered his document analysis. Emma would lose her father to federal prison, while contaminated insulin continued killing diabetic children across the country. "They're coming for me," Henry said quietly, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "But the contamination evidence is real, and those children need immediate medical intervention. Don't let my mistakes prevent you from saving their lives." Victoria looked at the man who'd risked everything to protect patients he'd never meet, including potentially her own company's integrity. Outside the boardroom windows, she could see federal agents entering the building's marble lobby, their presence confirming that Henry's brave stand was about to cost him his freedom. The elevator doors opened with mechanical precision as federal agents stepped onto the executive floor of Meridian Global, their black suits and serious expressions cutting through the corporate atmosphere like a blade through silk. Special Agent Jennifer Morrison led the team, her badge glinting under the fluorescent lights as she approached Victoria's assistant with the authority of someone accustomed to dismantling corporate conspiracies. "We need to speak with Ms. Victoria Hartwell immediately regarding allegations of document theft and corporate fraud," Agent Morrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of federal law enforcement. "We also have a warrant for the arrest of Henry Smith, currently employed as maintenance staff at this facility." Victoria watched through the boardroom's glass walls as her assistant frantically tried to delay the agents, claiming the CEO was in an important meeting that couldn't be interrupted. But Henry knew his time had run out. The federal investigation he dreaded for 2 years was finally catching up with him, triggered by someone who'd discovered his midnight document analysis. "I have to turn myself in," Henry said quietly, moving toward the boardroom doors. "If I run, they'll tear this building apart looking for me, and that delays any chance of stopping the contaminated insulin shipments." Victoria grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Wait, something doesn't add up here. How did federal agents learn about your document discovery so quickly? You only found this evidence 12 hours ago." Dr. Martinez looked up from her urgent calls to pediatric hospitals across the country. Victoria's right. Federal investigations require weeks of preliminary work before arrest warrants are issued. Someone tipped them off with advance knowledge of what Henry discovered. The realization hit Victoria like a physical blow. Zenith knew we'd found the contamination evidence. That's why Reeves was so desperate to complete the merger immediately. He needed legal liability transferred to us before federal prosecutors could hold his company responsible for the patient deaths. He ate us. Henry's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mrs. Patterson. He answered quickly, his heart racing with fears about Emma's safety. "Mrs. Patterson, is everything okay?" "Henry, dear, there are 2 men in suits asking questions about you in the apartment building lobby." Her worried voice came through clearly in the silent boardroom. "They're showing badges and asking neighbors about your work schedule and Emma's medical condition. I took her to my sister's house across town. But I think you need to know they're investigating your family." The blood drained from Henry's face as he realized the investigation had already reached Emma. Federal agents were questioning his neighbors, learning about his daughter's diabetes, building a case that would paint him as a desperate father willing to commit corporate espionage to protect his child's medical needs. Victoria watched Henry's expression crumble with paternal terror. "They're going after his daughter," she told Dr. Martinez. "This isn't just about corporate fraud. They're building a narrative that Henry stole documents out of personal desperation rather than public safety concerns." Dr. Martinez's phone rang with another emergency call from the CDC. She answered on speaker, her face grave as the federal epidemiologist's voice filled the boardroom. "Dr. Martinez, we've now confirmed 43 cases of severe insulin-related infections across 7 states. Preliminary testing suggests bacterial contamination in NovoRapid insulin manufactured at the Zenith Pharmaceuticals facility in the Philippines. We need immediate access to manufacturing records and quality control data." "The CDC wants Zenith's manufacturing records," Dr. Martinez announced. "But those documents are exactly what Henry photographed from our recycling bins. If federal agents arrest him before we can turn over this evidence, the investigation could be delayed by weeks while children continue dying from contaminated insulin." Victoria's intercom crackled with her assistant's increasingly panicked voice. "Ms. Hartwell, the federal agents are demanding immediate access to the boardroom. They say they have evidence of criminal conspiracy between Meridian Global and a maintenance employee engaged in corporate espionage." Through the glass walls, Victoria could see Agent Morrison approaching with a team of 6 federal investigators. Their confident strides and prepared documentation suggested they believed they had an airtight case against Henry. But Victoria's sharp legal mind recognized something crucial about their timing and approach. They don't know about the contamination, she realized aloud. These agents think Henry stole merger documents for financial gain, not to expose pharmaceutical fraud. Someone at Zenith called in the investigation to discredit Henry before his evidence could damage their deal. Henry understood the trap with crystalline clarity. Zenith's executives had manipulated federal law enforcement to protect their contaminated insulin conspiracy. By framing his document discovery as corporate espionage, they'd turned his attempt to save lives into apparent criminal behavior that would be dismissed as desperate fabrication. The boardroom doors opened as Agent Morrison entered with federal authority, her eyes immediately fixing on Henry in his janitor's uniform. "Henry Smith, you're under arrest for violations of the Economic Espionage Act, theft of trade secrets, and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud." She began reading his Miranda rights while other agents positioned themselves to prevent any escape attempts. "Agent Morrison," Victoria interrupted with the commanding presence that had built a pharmaceutical empire. "Before you arrest Mr. Smith, you need to understand that his document discovery has exposed contaminated insulin that's currently killing diabetic children in hospitals across the country." Agent Morrison paused mid-sentence, her professional instincts recognizing the shift from corporate crime to public safety emergency. "What contaminated insulin?" Dr. Martinez stepped forward with the medical authority of someone who'd saved thousands of lives through vaccine development. "We have documentation proving systematic bacterial contamination in insulin manufactured by Zenith Pharmaceuticals. 43 patients are currently hospitalized with infections directly traceable to contaminated medication. The CDC is investigating what may become one of the worst pharmaceutical disasters in modern history." Agent Morrison examined the evidence on Henry's phone, her expression shifting from law enforcement certainty to growing alarm as she absorbed the medical implications. The bacterial contamination levels, manufacturing facility reports, and executive email correspondence painted a picture of corporate fraud that went far beyond simple document theft. These manufacturing records show deliberate safety violations that could kill hundreds of patients, Agent Morrison said, her voice tight with recognition of the broader conspiracy. "But Mr. Smith obtained this evidence through illegal document theft. Even if the contamination is real, his methods compromise our ability to prosecute the pharmaceutical executives responsible." Henry felt the cruel irony settling around him like chains. His illegal discovery of the contamination evidence had made him a criminal, but it had also made the evidence potentially inadmissible in federal court. Zenith's executives might escape prosecution for their systematic fraud because of the very methods Henry had used to expose their crimes. "Furthermore," Agent Morrison continued, "Zenith Pharmaceuticals filed the initial complaint that triggered this investigation. They claim Mr. Smith has been conducting corporate espionage for months, possibly selling trade secrets to competitors. His contamination allegations could be an attempt to deflect attention from his criminal activities." Victoria realized with mounting horror that Zenith had orchestrated a perfect legal trap. By reporting Henry's document theft to federal authorities before he could expose their contamination conspiracy, they'd transformed him from whistleblower to criminal. Even worse, they'd positioned themselves as victims of corporate espionage rather than perpetrators of public health fraud. The handcuffs clicked around Henry's wrists with metallic finality as Agent Morrison prepared to transport him to federal detention. Outside the boardroom windows, news crews were already gathering to cover what they believed was a corporate espionage arrest at one of the nation's largest pharmaceutical companies. "My daughter," Henry said desperately as agents led him toward the elevator. "She's 11 years old and diabetic. She needs the contaminated insulin to survive, but she also needs someone to protect her if I'm in prison." Victoria watched federal agents escort away the only person who'd been willing to risk everything to save her company from inheriting a public health catastrophe. Emma Smith would lose her father to federal prison while contaminated insulin continued killing children across the country, and Zenith's executives would complete their $8 billion merger with their crimes hidden behind Henry's arrest. The system designed to protect patients and punish corporate fraud had been weaponized to silence the very person trying to save lives. Victoria stood frozen in her empty boardroom, watching federal agents escort Henry toward the elevator in handcuffs, while the unsigned merger documents lay scattered across the mahogany table like evidence of her own moral cowardice. The weight of her decision pressed down on her shoulders with crushing intensity. sign the deal and inherit responsibility for contaminated medicine already killing children, or destroy her company fighting a battle that Henry's arrest had seemingly made unwinnable. Dr. Martinez closed her phone after another devastating conversation with the CDC, her medical training struggling to process the scope of the emerging catastrophe. 59 confirmed cases now, Victoria. Children's hospitals in 12 states are reporting severe infections in diabetic patients. The mortality rate is climbing faster than our epidemiologists can track. She looked up with the haunted expression of someone who dedicated their career to healing, only to witness systematic corporate murder disguised as business strategy. Victoria's hands trembled as she lifted one of Henry's photographs, studying the bacterial contamination data with the pharmaceutical expertise that had built her reputation. The evidence was irrefutable. Zenith had knowingly shipped lethal medication to vulnerable patients, while planning to transfer legal liability through the merger. But Henry's arrest had transformed him from credible whistleblower to discredited corporate spy, making his evidence legally compromised and potentially inadmissible in court. "They played us perfectly," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying the bitter recognition of corporate manipulation she'd never experienced from the victim's perspective. "Zenith reported Henry's document theft before we could expose their contamination conspiracy. Now every piece of evidence he discovered is tainted by criminal acquisition methods." The boardroom doors opened as Victoria's legal counsel, Thomas Brennan, rushed in with the panicked energy of someone trying to prevent multiple catastrophes simultaneously. His usually perfect suit was disheveled, his silver hair uncombed, his expensive briefcase bulging with emergency documentation he'd been preparing since the FBI arrival. "Victoria, we have approximately 18 minutes before Zenith's legal team files breach of contract lawsuits that will bankrupt this company," Brennan announced without preamble. "Jonathan Reeves is demanding immediate completion of the merger or $400 million in penalty damages. Meanwhile, federal prosecutors are treating us as co-conspirators in Henry Smith's alleged corporate espionage." Victoria felt the trap closing around her with suffocating precision. Every legal avenue seemed to lead toward the same devastating outcome: either sign the contaminated merger and inherit criminal liability for patient deaths, or refuse to sign and face financial destruction while contaminated insulin continued killing children anyway. But something in Henry's desperate final words nagged at her brilliant mind. His concern hadn't been for his own freedom or legal consequences. He'd been worried about his daughter's survival and protection. A man facing federal prison had prioritized his child's welfare over his own freedom, displaying the kind of parental courage that transcended personal risk. "Thomas, I need you to arrange immediate legal representation for Henry Smith," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength as moral clarity began cutting through corporate complications. "The best criminal defense attorney in Chicago, with full payment guaranteed by Meridian Global." Brennan stared at her with undisguised alarm. "Victoria, providing legal assistance to an accused corporate spy makes us appear complicit in his alleged crimes. Federal prosecutors could interpret that as obstruction of justice or conspiracy to commit fraud." "Then let them," Victoria replied with the decisive authority that had revolutionized 3 different drug categories before her 30th birthday. "Henry risked everything to protect patients we've never met. The least we can do is ensure he has competent legal representation while we figure out how to stop this contamination disaster." Dr. Martinez's phone buzzed with another emergency medical update. Her face grew increasingly grave as she absorbed information from overwhelmed pediatric specialists across the country. "Victoria, we're now looking at potential casualties in the hundreds. Some of these children won't survive the weekend without immediate intervention. But every hospital that stops using Zenith insulin puts their diabetic patients at risk of ketoacidosis and death." The cruel paradox was devastating. The same medication keeping diabetic children alive was simultaneously killing them through bacterial infection. Hospitals faced impossible choices between different types of patient mortality, while Zenith's executives counted profits from their systematic fraud. Victoria's intercom crackled with her assistant's increasingly desperate voice. "Ms. Hartwell, Jonathan Reeves is on line 1, demanding immediate confirmation of merger completion. The media is reporting Henry Smith's arrest as a corporate espionage scandal involving stolen pharmaceutical secrets. Stock prices are dropping rapidly as investors lose confidence in the deal." Victoria looked at the phone with crystalline understanding of what Reeves really wanted. Not just her signature on merger documents, but her complicit silence in a contamination conspiracy that would make her company legally responsible for ongoing patient deaths. He needed Meridian Global to inherit criminal liability before federal investigators could trace accountability back to Zenith's manufacturing facilities. "Put me through to Jonathan," Victoria said, her voice carrying the steel that had earned her recognition as one of the pharmaceutical industry's most formidable negotiators. "Maze." Reeves' voice filled the boardroom with barely controlled desperation masquerading as corporate authority. "Victoria, we need to finalize this merger immediately. Your maintenance employees' criminal activities have created unnecessary complications, but our legal teams have confirmed the deal remains binding regardless of external disruptions." "Jonathan," Victoria replied with deceptive calm, "I've been reviewing the contamination evidence that Henry discovered in your manufacturing facilities. Before I sign anything, I need immediate explanations for bacterial levels exceeding safety thresholds by over 800%. A long silence followed before Reeves responded, his tone shifting to calculated damage control. "I'm not sure what fraudulent documents your corporate spy claims to have found, but Zenith Pharmaceuticals maintains the highest manufacturing standards in the industry. Any allegations to the contrary are desperate fabrications by a man facing federal prison for industrial espionage." Victoria activated her phone's recording function, a legal precaution her father had taught her during her earliest business negotiations. "So you're denying knowledge of Pseudomonas aeruginosa contamination in your Baton facility insulin production lines?" Another pause, longer this time, as Reeves recognized the trap Victoria was constructing. "Any manufacturing data allegedly stolen from our facilities would be inadmissible in legal proceedings due to criminal acquisition methods. Victoria, I hope you realize that continued delays based on fabricated evidence could constitute bad faith negotiation and breach of fiduciary duty to your shareholders." Dr. Martinez handed Victoria a tablet displaying the latest CDC contamination reports, her medical expertise translating bureaucratic language into human tragedy. Children's photographs accompanied clinical summaries: 11-year-old Jessica Chen in Detroit, 9-year-old Marcus Rodriguez in Phoenix, 7-year-old Sarah Kim in Atlanta. All fighting for their lives because of insulin they'd trusted to keep them healthy. Victoria stared at the children's faces, seeing Emma Smith's innocent trust reflected in their hospital photographs. These were the patients she'd dedicated her life to protecting through pharmaceutical innovation and uncompromising safety standards. Henry had risked federal prison to save them while she sat in corporate luxury debating legal technicalities. "Jonathan," Victoria said with quiet finality, "I'm terminating merger negotiations pending full investigation of manufacturing contamination in your insulin production facilities. Meridian Global will not inherit legal responsibility for contaminated medication that's currently killing diabetic children." The silence that followed carried the weight of an $8 billion deal collapsing in real time. When Reeves finally responded, his voice carried the cold fury of someone whose criminal conspiracy had been exposed by corporate courage. "Victoria, you've just destroyed your company to protect a corporate spy who stole confidential manufacturing data. Our legal team will pursue maximum damages for breach of contract, tortious interference, and conspiracy to commit industrial espionage. By tomorrow morning, Meridian Global will be facing bankruptcy proceedings that will eliminate your ability to help anyone." Victoria looked around her boardroom at the merger documents she would never sign, knowing that her decision would likely cost her the company her father had built, and she had transformed into a pharmaceutical empire. But she also knew that Henry Smith was sitting in federal detention because he'd chosen courage over comfort, public safety over personal security. Now it was her turn to choose what kind of person she wanted to be when everything was at stake. 24 hours later, Victoria stood before a packed emergency session of the Securities and Exchange Commission, her corporate empire crumbling around her while she fought the most important battle of her professional life. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago buzzed with activity as pharmaceutical executives, government officials, and media representatives gathered to witness what would become either the exposure of the largest medical fraud in modern history or the destruction of a respected CEO who'd chosen conscience over corporate survival. Henry sat in federal detention, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits surrounding the courtroom proceedings. But his legal situation had changed dramatically overnight. Victoria's promise to provide top-tier legal representation had materialized in the form of Margaret Chen, Chicago's most feared criminal defense attorney, whose reputation for dismantling federal prosecutions preceded her into every courtroom she entered. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Chen addressed the packed courtroom with the authority of someone who'd never lost a case involving corporate whistleblowing. My client Henry Smith discovered evidence of systematic pharmaceutical fraud that has already killed 17 children and hospitalized over 80 diabetic patients across 14 states. His methods of obtaining this evidence were technically illegal, but his motivations were pure, saving the lives of vulnerable patients, including his own diabetic daughter. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Park, rose with the confidence of someone backed by seemingly irrefutable criminal evidence. Your Honor, regardless of Mr. Smith's stated motivations, he committed serious federal crimes by stealing confidential corporate documents and conducting unauthorized surveillance of pharmaceutical manufacturing operations. The Economic Espionage Act exists to protect American businesses from exactly this type of criminal activity. But Margaret Chen had spent the past 18 hours constructing a legal defense that would transform Henry from criminal to hero. She activated a large screen display showing hospital photographs that made everyone in the courtroom understand the human cost of Zenith's fraud. These are the faces of children who trusted pharmaceutical companies to provide safe medication. Jessica Chen, age 11, died yesterday morning from sepsis caused by contaminated insulin. Marcus Rodriguez, age 9, requires emergency liver transplant surgery due to bacterial infections from medication his parents trusted to keep him alive. Victoria watched from the gallery as Margaret Chen systematically dismantled the federal prosecution's case. The defense attorney had obtained independent laboratory analysis confirming every contamination claim in Henry's evidence. She'd secured testimony from CDC epidemiologists who validated the bacterial identification and infection patterns. Most importantly, she documented a timeline proving that Zenith executives knew about the contamination months before Henry's discovery. Furthermore, Your Honor, Margaret Chen continued with building momentum. We have recorded conversations between my client and Zenith executives in which they explicitly deny knowledge of contamination while simultaneously threatening legal retaliation for exposing their fraud. These recordings demonstrate that Zenith Pharmaceuticals orchestrated Mr. Smith's arrest to prevent exposure of their criminal conspiracy. The courtroom stirred as Margaret Chen played Victoria's recorded conversation with Jonathan Reeves. His denials of contamination knowledge, followed immediately by threats against both Henry and Meridian Global, painted a clear picture of corporate cover-up and witness intimidation. Federal prosecutors exchanged worried glances as their seemingly solid case began collapsing under the weight of contrary evidence. But the most devastating testimony came from Dr. Elena Martinez, whose medical expertise and unimpeachable reputation gave scientific credibility to Henry's contamination discoveries. She explained the bacterial contamination process in terms that made its lethality unmistakable, then documented how Zenith's cost-cutting measures had eliminated safety protocols specifically designed to prevent patient deaths. Based on my analysis of the manufacturing data, Dr. Martinez testified with clinical precision, Zenith Pharmaceuticals made calculated decisions to ship contaminated insulin rather than absorb financial losses from proper sterilization procedures. They prioritized profit margins over patient survival, knowing that bacterial infections would likely prove fatal in immunocompromised diabetic patients. Judge Patricia Williams, a respected federal jurist with 30 years of experience in corporate fraud cases, listened to the testimony with growing alarm. The evidence presented by Henry's defense team painted a picture of systematic patient endangerment that went far beyond simple corporate espionage. Children were dying from contaminated medication while executives counted merger profits. Mr. Park, Judge Williams addressed the federal prosecutor with barely concealed skepticism. Are you seriously asking this court to imprison the only person who attempted to prevent ongoing patient deaths from contaminated pharmaceuticals? Assistant U.S. Attorney Park recognized his case disintegrating in real time. The criminal charges that had seemed ironclad 24 hours earlier now appeared to be part of a corporate conspiracy to silence legitimate whistleblowing. Your Honor, while the contamination allegations are troubling, Mr. Smith's criminal methods cannot be overlooked simply because his motives were admirable. Margaret Chen seized the prosecutor's concession with surgical precision. Your Honor, my client's so-called criminal methods consisted of photographing documents that were literally discarded in recycling bins. Zenith Pharmaceuticals threw away evidence of their own fraud. then claimed corporate espionage when someone retrieved it from the trash. This prosecution is designed to intimidate whistleblowers and protect corporate criminals. The courtroom's attention shifted to the gallery where Jonathan Reeves sat with Zenith's legal team, their confident expressions replaced by obvious panic as their carefully constructed legal strategy collapsed. Reeves whispered urgently to his attorneys, recognizing that the federal case they'd orchestrated to discredit Henry was instead exposing their own criminal liability. Victoria felt a surge of satisfaction watching Zenith's executives squirm under judicial scrutiny. Her decision to provide Henry's legal defense had transformed a corporate espionage prosecution into a public health investigation that threatened to send pharmaceutical executives to prison for patient deaths. But her satisfaction was tempered by the financial reality of her choice. Zenith's lawsuit against Meridian Global was proceeding in parallel civil court, seeking $400 million in damages for breach of contract. Her company's stock price had collapsed as investors fled the controversy. Board members were demanding her resignation. The pharmaceutical empire she'd built was hemorrhaging value while she fought to clear Henry's name. Judge Williams called for a recess to review the evidence, but her preliminary comments suggested the federal prosecution was doomed. This court is deeply troubled by evidence suggesting that serious federal crimes were committed not by the defendant, but by the pharmaceutical executives who reported him to federal authorities. During the break, Victoria approached Henry for the first time since his arrest. The orange jumpsuit couldn't diminish the dignity in his weathered face or the gratitude in his eyes as he recognized the personal cost of her support. "Emma asks about you every day," Victoria said quietly. "Mrs. Patterson has been taking excellent care of her, but she needs her father home." Henry's voice was rough with emotion. "You sacrificed your company to save my daughter and all those other children. I don't know how to thank someone for that kind of courage." Victoria looked around the courthouse at the media circus, federal agents, and pharmaceutical executives whose presence represented the collision of corporate power with individual conscience. "You showed me what real courage looks like when you stood up in that boardroom. Everything else has been trying to live up to your example." When court reconvened, Judge Williams delivered a ruling that would reshape pharmaceutical industry accountability forever. This court finds that Mr. Henry Smith's actions, while technically violations of corporate espionage statutes, were undertaken to prevent ongoing patient deaths from contaminated medication. His discovery of systematic pharmaceutical fraud constitutes protected whistleblowing under federal patient safety statutes. The ruling dismissed all criminal charges against Henry while ordering immediate federal investigation of Zenith Pharmaceuticals for patient endangerment, fraud, and witness intimidation. Jonathan Reeves and his executive team would face the same federal prosecution they'd tried to orchestrate against Henry. But Victoria's victory in federal court came at enormous personal cost. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions about Meridian Global's financial collapse, her board's demands for resignation, and the $400 million lawsuit that threatened to bankrupt the company she'd spent her life building. Henry walked out of federal detention a free man, but Victoria walked into an uncertain future where her courage had cost her everything she'd worked to achieve. 6 weeks after the federal courthouse victory, Henry sat in the modest conference room of what had once been Meridian Global's executive wing, now serving as headquarters for Phoenix Safety Solutions, the pharmaceutical consulting firm he and Victoria had built from the ashes of their destroyed careers. The irony of the company name wasn't lost on him. Like the mythical bird, they had risen from the flames of corporate destruction to create something entirely new and purposeful. Emma bounced excitedly in the chair beside him, her backpack stuffed with homework from Lincoln Academy, the private school that had offered her a full academic scholarship, after news outlets discovered she was the diabetic daughter whose potential contamination had triggered her father's whistleblowing. At 12 years old, she had become an unexpected symbol of why pharmaceutical safety mattered, her bright smile and articulate interviews helping the public understand that corporate fraud had real faces and personal consequences. "Dad, can I show Miss Victoria my science fair project before the meeting starts?" Emma asked, pulling out a detailed poster board displaying her award-winning research on bacterial contamination in pharmaceutical manufacturing. The project had earned first place at the state science fair, with judges praising her sophisticated understanding of sterilization protocols and manufacturing safety standards. Victoria entered the conference room carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of casual business attire that would have been unthinkable during her corporate executive days. The designer suits and perfect makeup had been replaced by comfortable slacks and minimal jewelry, reflecting someone who had discovered that authentic success felt different from corporate achievement. Her hair was shorter now, less formally styled, and the stress lines around her eyes had softened into something resembling contentment. "I'd love to see your project, Emma," Victoria said, settling into a chair that cost a fraction of the executive furniture she'd once taken for granted. "I heard from Mrs. Patterson that you're already getting letters from university science programs interested in your research." Emma beamed with pride as she explained her bacterial identification techniques and contamination prevention strategies, her presentation displaying the kind of scientific rigor that would have impressed pharmaceutical executives twice her age. Henry watched his daughter with the deep satisfaction of a parent witnessing their child's intellectual gifts flourishing under circumstances he could never have provided alone. The past 6 weeks had transformed all of their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. Victoria's board had forced her resignation from Meridian Global within days of the courthouse victory, citing fiduciary irresponsibility and destruction of shareholder value. The company's stock had recovered somewhat after federal investigations confirmed the wisdom of avoiding the contaminated merger, but the board's decision to remove Victoria had been irreversible. Zenith Pharmaceuticals had collapsed entirely under federal prosecution and civil lawsuits. Jonathan Reeves and Rebecca Walsh were awaiting trial on charges including patient endangerment, corporate fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Their manufacturing facilities had been shuttered, their contaminated insulin recalled globally, and their assets frozen pending restitution to victims' families. The pharmaceutical industry had gained a new understanding that safety violations carried serious criminal consequences. Henry's vindication in federal court had been complete, but his return to pharmaceutical consulting had required rebuilding professional relationships destroyed by his Phoenix biotech termination. Industry colleagues who had shunned him after the Arthrogen scandal now sought his expertise in contamination prevention and manufacturing safety protocols. His reputation had been transformed from cautionary tale to inspirational example of scientific integrity under pressure. "Our first major client wants to meet next week," Victoria announced, opening her laptop to review the project proposal that would establish Phoenix Safety Solutions as a legitimate pharmaceutical consulting firm. Novamed Industries is requesting comprehensive safety audits for their entire manufacturing network after the Zenith scandal. They're offering a 2-year contract worth $800,000. Henry felt a surge of gratitude for the opportunity to return to meaningful pharmaceutical work without compromising his principles for corporate politics. Phoenix Safety Solutions had been structured as a benefit corporation, prioritizing patient safety and manufacturing integrity over maximum profitability. Their mission statement, framed on the conference room wall, read simply, "Protecting patients through uncompromising science." Emma looked up from her science project with the serious expression she'd inherited from both her parents. "Dad, will you be traveling for work like you used to? I don't want you to be gone all the time again." The question struck Henry with the weight of lessons learned through loss and redemption. His previous career had demanded constant travel, conference presentations, and client meetings that had kept him away from Sarah during her illness, and Emma during her early childhood. This time, he was determined to build professional success around family priorities rather than despite them. "The consulting work will be mostly local, sweetheart," Henry assured her. "Miss Victoria and I designed our company so we can work with pharmaceutical companies without sacrificing time with the people we love most." Victoria nodded with understanding born from her own isolation during corporate executive years. "We both learned that professional success doesn't mean much if you don't have family to share it with. Phoenix Safety Solutions will never require anyone to choose between career and personal relationships." Mrs. Patterson knocked on the conference room door, carrying a tray of Emma's favorite cookies, and wearing the proud expression of someone whose extended family had survived a crisis stronger than before. At 73, she had become Phoenix Safety Solutions' unofficial office manager, providing the kind of nurturing stability that kept small businesses functioning while their founders focused on professional challenges. "The reporter from Pharmaceutical Weekly is here for your interview," Mrs. Patterson announced. "She is very interested in how your company plans to change industry safety standards." The media attention had been overwhelming initially, with Henry and Victoria featured on magazine covers as symbols of corporate courage and pharmaceutical reform. Emma had appeared on several television programs, her articulate explanations of diabetes management and medication safety helping viewers understand why manufacturing integrity mattered beyond abstract regulatory compliance. But the most meaningful recognition had come from patient advocacy groups and medical professionals who understood that Henry's whistleblowing had saved lives. Children's hospitals had invited him to speak about pharmaceutical safety. Diabetes organizations had honored Emma for raising awareness about contamination risks. Medical journals had published Victoria's research on corporate governance and patient protection. "Before we meet with the reporter," Victoria said, "I wanted to update you both on the federal investigation results. The CDC confirmed that Zenith's contaminated insulin was responsible for 23 patient deaths and over 100 severe infections. Our evidence prevented thousands of additional casualties by stopping the merger and triggering the recall." Henry absorbed the statistics with the complex emotions of someone whose actions had saved lives at enormous personal cost. 23 families had lost children because pharmaceutical executives prioritized profits over safety protocols. But hundreds of other families still had their children because he'd found the courage to speak up when everything was at stake. Emma reached over and squeezed her father's hand with the intuitive understanding that children develop when they've witnessed adults making difficult moral choices. "You and Miss Victoria saved all those kids, didn't you, Dad?" Henry looked around the modest conference room at the pharmaceutical consulting firm built on principles of scientific integrity and patient protection. At Victoria, whose sacrifice of corporate power had enabled their mission of manufacturing safety. At Emma, whose health and happiness had motivated his transformation from silent coward to vocal advocate. At Mrs. Patterson, whose unconditional support had provided the foundation for their unconventional family. "We saved each other, sweetheart," Henry said quietly. "Sometimes the most important work we do is protecting people we've never met, because that's how we protect the people we love most." The reporter knocked on the conference room door, ready to document how a janitor's courage and a CEO's conscience had created a pharmaceutical consulting firm dedicated to ensuring that corporate priorities never again trumped patient safety. Phoenix Safety Solutions had risen from the ashes of their destroyed careers, stronger and more purposeful than anything they'd built before. 1 year later, Henry stood before the Chicago Children's Hospital Foundation Gala, addressing an audience of pharmaceutical executives, medical professionals, and patient advocacy representatives who had gathered to honor the heroes of the Zenith contamination scandal. Emma sat in the front row beside Victoria and Mrs. Patterson, her 13-year-old face glowing with pride at watching her father receive the Patient Safety Champion Award from an organization that had once seemed impossibly distant from their modest apartment in Riverside Heights. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant table settings, but Henry felt most comfortable in the knowledge that every person present understood why his janitor's uniform had mattered more than corporate suits on that pivotal afternoon when he'd interrupted an $8 billion merger to save lives. The audience included families of children who had survived contaminated insulin infections, parents whose diabetic sons and daughters were alive because Henry had found the courage to speak truth to corporate power. 18 months ago, I was cleaning offices and trying to remain invisible, Henry began, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had developed through surviving federal prosecution and rebuilding his professional reputation. I believed that keeping my head down and avoiding controversy was the safest way to protect my daughter and preserve what little stability we'd managed to create after losing everything. In the audience, Dr. Elena Martinez nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed Henry's transformation from desperate janitor to respected pharmaceutical safety consultant. Phoenix Safety Solutions had grown into a nationally recognized firm with 23 employees conducting manufacturing audits for pharmaceutical companies across 3 continents. Their rigorous safety protocols had prevented 4 additional contamination incidents in the past year, saving countless lives through the application of uncompromising scientific standards. But sometimes, Henry continued, his gaze finding Emma's encouraging smile, the most dangerous choice is staying silent when we have the power to prevent harm. My daughter taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting to protect others even when we're terrified of the consequences. Victoria watched from her seat at the head table, her heart full with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that authentic success felt completely different from corporate achievement. Meridian Global had eventually recovered from the Zenith merger crisis under new leadership, but Victoria had never regretted her decision to sacrifice executive power for moral integrity. Phoenix Safety Solutions had given her work that mattered beyond stock prices and quarterly earnings. the opportunity to ensure that pharmaceutical manufacturing served patient welfare rather than shareholder profits. Emma felt tears of pride welling in her eyes as she listened to her father address the very pharmaceutical executives who had once dismissed him as expendable maintenance staff. Her science fair research on contamination prevention had evolved into published academic papers, with several universities already expressing interest in her future enrollment despite her young age. She had learned that intellect combined with moral courage could change entire industries, lessons that would guide her own career choices in years to come. Mrs. Patterson dabbed her eyes with a tissue, remembering the desperate man who had returned from his night shift 2 years ago carrying evidence that would either save lives or destroy his family's fragile stability. The widow who had lost 2 husbands and raised 5 children understood better than most how rarely life offered second chances for redemption and renewal. Watching Henry receive recognition for the courage she had helped him find filled her heart with the deep satisfaction of someone whose support had enabled extraordinary change. The families in this room tonight represent the human cost of corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms, Henry said, his voice growing stronger as he approached the heart of his message. Jessica Chen, Marcus Rodriguez, Sarah Kim, and 17 other children died because pharmaceutical executives chose profit margins over patient safety. But their deaths were not meaningless if we ensure that such choices never happen again. The audience stirred with the emotional weight of tragedy transformed into purpose. In the 2 years since the Zenith scandal, pharmaceutical industry regulations had been strengthened significantly. Manufacturing facilities faced mandatory independent safety audits. Corporate executives could be held personally liable for patient deaths caused by safety violations. Whistleblower protections had been expanded to encourage employees to report contamination and fraud without fear of retaliation. Henry's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Chen, his former defense attorney who had become a close family friend. The message contained a photograph from the federal courthouse where Jonathan Reeves and Rebecca Walsh had just been sentenced to 12 years in prison for patient endangerment and corporate fraud. Justice had finally been served for the executives who had orchestrated systematic contamination while planning to escape accountability through merger manipulation. But tonight isn't just about honoring the past, Henry continued, his words carrying the wisdom earned through suffering and redemption. It's about acknowledging that each of us has the power to choose courage over comfort when lives are at stake. Victoria Hartwell sacrificed a pharmaceutical empire to protect patients she'd never met. Emma Smith learned that scientific knowledge carries moral responsibility. Mrs. Patterson showed that supporting others' courage multiplies our own impact. Victoria rose from her seat to join Henry at the podium, their partnership representing the transformation possible when corporate power serves moral purpose rather than personal advancement. Phoenix Safety Solutions exists because we learned that the most valuable mergers aren't signed on paper. They're written in the hearts of people who choose to stand together for what's right. Emma watched her father and Victoria standing side by side, understanding that she was witnessing the kind of authentic success that couldn't be measured in stock prices or executive titles. Their pharmaceutical consulting firm had grown not through corporate conquest but through the patient trust earned by prioritizing safety over profits. Their unconventional family had formed not through traditional relationships but through shared commitment to protecting vulnerable people from corporate harm. Henry concluded his acceptance speech by reading the names of every child who had survived contaminated insulin infections because of the recall triggered by his whistleblowing. 27 names, 27 faces, 27 families who still gathered around dinner tables because a janitor had found the courage to interrupt a merger signing and speak truth to power. These children are alive tonight because sometimes the most important work we do happens when we think nobody is watching, Henry said. When we choose integrity over security, when we protect strangers as if they were our own family, when we remember that courage is contagious and moral choices have consequences that ripple far beyond our own lives. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes, but Henry barely noticed the applause. His attention was focused on Emma's radiant smile, Victoria's proud nod, and Mrs. Patterson's tearful embrace. These were the people who had taught him that family could be chosen rather than inherited, that professional success meant nothing without personal integrity, and that the greatest victories were measured not in dollars earned but in lives saved. As the evening concluded with champagne toasts and heartfelt conversations between families whose children had survived pharmaceutical fraud, Henry reflected on the journey that had transformed him from broken janitor to respected safety advocate. The path had demanded sacrificing everything he thought he needed to protect, but it had given him everything he'd never dared to hope for: authentic work, chosen family, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that his courage had saved lives. Emma linked her arm through her father's as they walked toward the exit, already discussing her plans for next year's science fair project on pharmaceutical innovation and patient advocacy. Victoria and Mrs. Patterson followed behind them, their conversation mixing business planning with family logistics in the easy rhythm of people who had learned to balance professional purpose with personal relationships. Outside the Hospital Foundation Gala, Chicago's skyline glittered with the lights of a city where corporate power and individual conscience had collided, creating changes that would protect vulnerable patients for generations to come. Henry Smith had discovered that sometimes the most valuable deals in life aren't negotiated in boardrooms. They're forged in moments of moral courage when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things for others they may never meet. The janitor's uniform was long gone, but the courage it had contained would echo through pharmaceutical safety standards for decades, proving that integrity and love create legacies more enduring than any corporate empire. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.